Welcome to the final session of our COVID class this summer. My name is Ashley Biser, and I teach in the Politics and Government Department at Ohio Wesleyan. And yes, I want to welcome you to the last panel titled "The Future is Ours. What does life look like after the coronavirus?" It's an honor to be here today with my colleagues. I'm pleased that I'm joined by Laurie Anderson and Suren Ambegaokar, who are both here from botany microbiology. Michele Nobel is joining us from education, Anne Sokolsky from comparative literature, Nancy Gamso from music, Liz Nix and Chris Fink from health and human kinetics, Neuman de Vegvar from art history, and Saif Rahman are all here to join in today's conversation. I've learned so much from each of you over the course of the last few months, and I'm grateful for your efforts. It's been a real pleasure, and it's a real pleasure to get to talk to you again today. As I was preparing for today's panel, I found myself reflecting on the title that we gave it almost 2 months ago. It seems a little bit naive now to think about life after COVID. Instead, I find myself wondering what it means to forge the future we want to see within our current moment. This question is particularly poignant for me, both as a political theorist and as one who was trained at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. As a political theorist, I'm interested in big questions. What do we mean by democracy? What is freedom? Who counts as a citizen? My own work is centered around the thinking of Hannah Arendt. Arendt is most famous for her exploration of totalitarianism, and anyone who wants to understand what can happen when society loses the ability to tell fact from fiction will find her reflections on lying and politics fascinating. But what I find most useful in her thinking is her conviction that although human beings are capable of great evil, they are also able to make good decisions in moments when we don't quite know what is going on, when we can't quite figure out what principles should guide us, and when we don't quite know what the future will bring. Arendt suggests that in order to make good decisions in this kind of scenario, we need to be attentive to what has happened before. At the same time, we open ourselves to the newness of our own historical moment, recognizing both what it shares with past crises and what might be different about it. Arendt believes that if we attend to particularity and attempt to view the world from multiple perspectives, human beings can figure out what is right and wrong, even without tradition and universal principles to guide us. She talks about this activity in terms of training the imagination to go visiting, which is a phrase I just love. And she suggests that although it isn't foolproof, the attempt to see the world from another's perspective is critical to our ability to make good judgments in the midst of uncertain times. For my part, this is what the COVID course has taught me. I've been fascinated to learn what we share with those who've come before us and how those in different fields understand and make sense of the pandemic. This is the essence of the liberal arts. And if Arendt is right, the best way to navigate a moment when the ground seems to be shifting beneath our feet and to make good decisions about where we're going next. As I think about what it means to forge a future from within our current moment, I'm heartened by Arendt's conviction that understanding is possible, even when we don't have all the information, and that attempting to see the world from multiple perspectives might help us make good decisions about what to do in the future. And I'm excited to explore what might come next. I will say, as a political theorist trained in Minneapolis, Minnesota, I'm already seeing glimmers of what might be possible. Although we don't see it in the media, the people of Minneapolis are already organizing for a different future. Mutual aid societies are popping up left and right, and the people of that city are working together to rebuild it in ways that respect all of its citizens. If you forgive me for mixing a few metaphors and cliches, not only is the future ours, the future is now. And so I'd like to turn to my colleagues to get a sense of what they've learned over the past few months and what their hopes are for the future. I'm going to turn to each of them individually to ask first what they've learned from the course that we've all been taking here together. And so I'm going to turn first to Chris Fink from HHK. If you could tell us a little bit about what you've learned over the past couple months.
Sure, thanks. And thanks for everybody who's attending. And again, I'm excited to hear the opinions and perspectives of everyone. I think one of the things that, and you can hear me okay, right? Everybody, okay. One of the things that I came into the class really, so my background has a lot of link to the public health world, but mostly in preventative disease, not infectious disease. So, you know, for me, there was a lot to learn around that, but also I think a lot of the people who I work with in the public health realm are also trying to square this balance between economics and health outcomes. And so while I learned a lot from a lot of different of our presenters, I think I was really focused on listening to the economic, perspective, and really took a lot from both Dr. Gitter and Dr. Rahman. So it was, I think for me, eye-opening and sometimes concerning, sometimes heartening to think about, perspectives on what could be coming, these different shaped curves. Both of you mentioned that. I think, we all want to hope. Another thought sort of comes to mind around hope, but we all want to hope for the very best outcomes, but we do have to step back and think about what are the probabilities and probable economic impacts and things like that. So, specific things stood out to me too, particularly one thing that really caught my interest, and actually all morning and even last night, I was looking through some of the data from that part of Southwest India that you mentioned that has such a large population and a small death rate from COVID, and just thinking about which steps were taken around contact tracing and masks and other things like that. These weren't things that were surprising, but are great to get some reinforcement around, and how they weave into the economic perspective was really interesting. Another thing I think was cool was hearing, folks coming from the economic perspective or background, really talking about squaring economics and health. And so, I mean, we're all trying to find this middle ground of making best decisions, because certainly in the public health realm, if you want to reduce risk to next to zero, we can all bunker down alone, but there's impacts of that. So I'm rambling a little bit. I think for me, it was coming in kind of trying to understand reality, probabilities, hope, things like that around the economic impact of what's going on currently. Which leads me to Suren, to your presentation as well. Again, talking about, like, we would love a vaccine in 6 months, but and we want to hope for that, but at the same time, we have to understand these sort of realistic probabilities. And so, I don't know, I think maybe one of the things that came from this was some comfort in realistic discussion that isn't necessarily the best case scenario, but understanding it maybe being a little bit more centering or settling or something like that. So I'll leave it for someone else to step in.
Thank you, Chris. Michele, do you have a few reflections on what you've learned about the pandemic and just from our conversations here that you'd like to share?
Absolutely. I think at a time when there's a lot of fear about the future, what is happening, a lot of questions that are still completely uncertain, right? So my background is in education, and we're just starting to see some of the public schools roll things out for the fall. And there's a lot of mixed emotion and a lot of, I would say, a lot of fear. And so one of the things that I've really appreciated about this class and being able to hear different perspectives is really the value of interdisciplinary work and reminding ourselves how important it is to not just rely on one discipline or one area to solve all of our problems. These are complex, intertwined, interdependent issues. And all of us work in a liberal arts institution because we appreciate that already, right? And we gravitate toward it, and it's our comfort. But I think this course has allowed us to create a little larger platform where maybe folks who haven't considered how interdisciplinary work could solve real societal issues, if they've not considered it before, just watching the lectures and hearing the repeated themes, hearing about the impact of the arts, right, and literature. In education, those are places where we quickly cut when cuts are needed to be made. And listening to our colleagues speak so eloquently about comparative literature, poetry, music, fine art, and how those things really do allow us to reflect and survive when things are difficult. Even some of those first lectures that we had with Dr. Arnold going through pandemics of the past, and some of them I was unaware of in my own narrow history view, and seeing things come around in that cyclical way. And you know, it's a little bit refreshing. I think I get in my education world, and I'm just so focused on what is happening in our public schools. And it gave me a nice kind of escape from being so myopic and remembering to look more broadly to find the solutions that we seek in our public schools through all of our disciplines working together.
Thanks, Michele. Suren, would you like to speak to this?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So I think Michele and Chris have said a lot of things that that I also believe in or have learned as well. I think from my perspective, I guess there's two things I would think about this. One is that for my, you know, what I study, which is infectious disease and viruses, you know, this has been a really interesting process for me to see what I think of, you know, this being starting from coronavirus, right? We talk about it as coronavirus. And so when this course was kind of designed, and, you know, when I'm you know, very much every day I'm looking at all the data that's coming in and the papers as much as possible. But it's, you know, it's interesting for me to see how something gets so interconnected from one thing to something as large as this, you know, not only global level, you know, just in terms of geography, but in terms of all the different disciplines and how everything is interweaved into each other. And so it starts off as a virus that gets into public health idea, that gets into then talking about ecology, and talks about where the virus comes from. Then it gets into talking about you know, our schools and our systems, and then talking about our social inequalities, and talks about all food, you know, the food supplies and globalist perspective and economics, and just what you think as something so small or something so finite actually has all these connections that are kind of invisible until you actually have something that unravels that or unveils that. So it's been really interesting to me to see all the different ways that my colleagues have found ways, or have that with their lens to come into this, which for me has been very specific. You know, this is like what I do, and to see all these different ways to look at it, which I wouldn't have thought about before, has been really, really great, and has really showcased this power of the idea of the, you know, a liberal arts education in general. And so when I was thinking about, you know, the course itself and our the presentations we had, I was trying to think, well, what kind of really stood out to me, and I thought about it as two different ways. Like, what are the lectures that I felt like I could most respond to, like I could directly take with me to my next step, and also which one maybe surprised me the most in terms of how I thought about it as something that a connection to the pandemic. And so I would say probably Jim Franklin's talk and Francesca Nestro's talks about the kind of the politics and how you kind of create change. Speaking, you know, my presentation talked a lot about how our government, how much we need a government system to manage something that is like a public health idea. And if we need to actually, if we want to take that next step and try to work in managing this actually takes it's not just a science or medicine solution. It's a political solution as well. Well, it's a public policy solution as well. And so having some of that knowledge about how different countries manage their policies around public health, and how we as our government can work into making policy changes, I think was the most directly applicable to what I would do from a new perspective. And then the presentation I thought that was most surprising to me was Sokolsky's talk on the kind of the literature, the kind of pandemic literature. And I love what I thought was really, you know, I would say beautiful or moving was, you know, the memoir of the Japanese physician, how this, this one person who could see it and describe it coming like a wave and describing it and how that really resonates still to us now, and how there's some that connection, that kind of real personal connection to something that's 100 years ago still has such a powerful resonance. I thought was a really meaningful thing to connect it, to kind of humanize it. Again, coming from a scientific perspective, it's sometimes I kind of get lost in the data and in all the biology, but then to have this humanizing force behind it, I thought was really powerful as well. So I'll stop it there.
Thanks, Suren. I'd like to also, so the purpose when we started putting together this panel and the course was not just to think about what's happening now, but what might change in the future. And so the next question I'd like to have a few of our my colleagues speak to is really about, if you had one wish about what could change or what change looks like once the pandemic is over, or as I suggested, maybe not over, as Suren also pointed out in his point, we need to think about living in that. But if we can think about something that you would like to see change, what might that be? So I'm going to turn first to Saif Rahman to give us a perspective.
Thanks. Hello. Can you hear me okay? Okay. It's great to see you all, and it's been an amazing experience to watch and learn from the broader group and live through this time and seeing what is possible and what are the obstacles. In transitioning from the first question to the second question, if I may, let me just take a minute to add on to what Suren and Michele and Chris have shared. Just a couple of examples to point out not just the interdisciplinary value that we have in this, but also the liberal arts education. When I was watching Laurie's presentation, and this is not fair to just pick a couple or a few because there's so much value in all of the presentations, but the idea of deforestation having this link to the emerging diseases, the emerging infectious diseases, that was quite new to me. And while we talk about in economic development, deforestation and climate change and those types of things, it sort of opened up a pathway to think about these present crises with some of the other longstanding issues that we talk about. And then Michele sort of shared some of the stats on school closures versus social distancing, which I thought was very pertinent for us and for our schooling system. And just within the last couple of days, I think the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, came up with their guidance about United States, the school K through 12 needing to go back, that the costs and the benefits may seem to guide us that, keep them safe and don't have physical presence, but they're actually going the other way. So I thought that was very timely and very interesting. But I just wanted to take just a little bit extra to share that Dr. Poremsky, Karen Poremsky's talk really inspired me. She comes from English, I come from economics. We came to Ohio Wesleyan around the same time. I remember her little boy, who was little, who's no longer, little. But it really resonated with me because it put us in the same wavelength that I felt years ago, that we ought to think about what is important. And there are two things that I really remember strongly. One was the concept of survivance, that she talked about survival and resistance. And the other part was just this idea that behind all these numbers and statistics that are useful, definitely, get a grasp of what's happening in the scale of things or comparisons and such, but behind every number, there's something that's meaningful to people. And to keep that in mind, I think is very, very important. So in terms of looking at change and how I wish for change and what I see as possible ways of getting to change, if I could wish for one thing, I think I would wish for the genie that would grant me 3 wishes, because I would first of all wish for conscience, and second I would wish for courage, and third I would wish for memory. I would wish for conscience because I would want all of us not to forgive ourselves for errors that we have not corrected. I would wish for courage so that we know when to stand up and why to stand up and break our silence and our errors and the injustices that we either ignore or turn a blind eye to or don't even see. And I would like us to have a longer memory so that we never forget the acts of kindnesses and inspirations that we have been gifted by others, strangers or not, and remember what it feels like to have kindness, and also to remember the cruelties that are part of the human existence, and to not forget those even as we move through the crisis and move beyond it. And I think having conscience and having courage and having memory would give us the fundamental foundations for the kind of change that Ashley were talking about at the outset, which really resonated with me also. So when we look at how you then implement change from an economics standpoint, we generally think of incentives because most people tend to weigh pros and cons. And so if incentives are altered, then the way they weigh the pros and cons, that calculus could change, and they might opt for a different choice that might be beneficial overall for themselves, but also more importantly for a collective like a society. Motivations are the second element, and that relates to what is it that we are being driven by. And different people will be driven by different things, but that's something important that we try to think about to know where they are coming from, each person or each group. The third is norms that surround us. What are the norms that are developing, or what are the norms that we have inherited? That is something that in economics we don't oftentimes pay attention to closely enough, but there is a portion of economics that does focus on that, and I sort of like that portion a lot because it talks about how, like an organism, society evolves, how it changes. But there are constraints, and that's the fourth and final element that comes into play when we think about change. For example, if you look at minority populations in the United States, it's not simply about, data documents it relatively convincingly. It's not simply that they don't work hard. That's generally not true. It's not simply that they don't have access to housing, because that's been controlled for and there's still a major gap. It's not simply that they're not getting educated enough. That's been controlled for. It's not simply that they are not in high income category. That's been controlled for. Everything being controlled for, there is a massive gap between the minority population and majority population. And so that forces us to think about what are the constraints that may constrain our options. So in terms of incentives, motivations, norm, and constraints, in economics, we tend to focus oftentimes on the incentives and the motivations, and to some degree the constraints, but I think we could do a better job of delving into the role of constraints more institutionally and delving into the notion of norms. For example, the changes that are happening now in this country are beginning to create a critical mass where the norms may begin to change. And when we see the norms are changing around us, we form a different positioning that we feel more comfortable with. And that is part of how, if we don't take that into account, that we may miss potential gateways that are in front of us. About 10 or so years ago, I started working on this rural, impoverished area, elementary schooling, and it was very challenging, but within 2 to 3 years, I was able to help craft and then redesign and then redesign and redesign, refine to a point where finally the outcomes that we were hoping for were being delivered. And it was so challenging because you have to think about what they're thinking of, not what we are thinking of, what they're thinking of, what drives them, what are their constraints and why, and then see if it's possible to remove some of the barriers or constraints and also win their hearts in terms of this is why this is important. So that's how I think economics tends to look at it. And it's not easy because people are hard to change sometimes, but change is possible. Change is the only constant, they say. We just have to provide a compelling force to change the law of motion.
Thank you, Saif. I'm going to turn now to Liz Nix and ask her a similar question about if you could change something, what might it be?
So that's a big question. There's a lot of things that I would like to change, but one of the things that I've been thinking of in the food system perspective is that this really draws to light the idea of what's essential. So what's essential for us when it comes to gaining food, and then how do we value those essential people? So this is something that we've seen individuals who are giving like hero bonuses because they're essentially on this first, the first defense. They're up in the front lines of this coronavirus. They're being exposed to it more often. So I'm thinking of grocery store clerks, fast food workers, anybody who's working in the food industry. They're exposing themselves more than others. And then the other people who are extremely essential in our food system are farmers. And one of the things that you'll notice if you listen to the previous discussion that we had is this income disparities between these individuals and those who are in the top levels of the food processing industry and the food service industry. So these top level employees have reaching exponentially more of an income, a yearly income, than those who now we call essential. And so one of the things that I'd really like to see change with this is seeing us value individuals who we consider essential. This is a really complicated change, and I know that there's not really an easy way to do this, but I think that one of the things that I'm hopeful for is that this has really brought this to attention. And so people are looking at these individuals and saying, oh, these are kind of important people. Maybe we should provide sick days. Maybe we should provide healthcare. Maybe we should provide higher wages for individuals who we consider essential. But as Saif had mentioned, these changes are really slow in the food systems world. We consider, I usually talk about 3 different things that can highly influence change. It's culture, so going along with those norms, economy, once you get money involved, then people will start making changes, and policy. And so we've seen a lot of examples of this with coronavirus, and I feel like this is one of those things that I can see the biggest potential for change. There are a lot of other things I'd like to see change through the food system, but this is the one that I think was really drawn out for me in the food system.
Thanks, Liz. Anne, would you like to share some reflections on what needs to change and what might change and how that might happen?
And I'll try to be short. My lecture, I think I went over quite a bit. And I just wanted to do a shout out to my dad, who I know my mom and dad, I see there in the room. Suren, thank you for acknowledging my lecture. I've been spending basically ever since the lecture researching, translating that memoir. And it really is interesting because the character is this virus. So I have to like go into scientific literature to understand sort of the medicine that's going on in this memoir. And just 2 things that have struck me. I'm completely immersed right now in the first stages of translation, but the violent words that he uses to talk about the virus coming to their community is shinchu, which means invasion or infestation. But the other word that I've come across recently is okasu, which is it means to commit a crime, to perpetrate, to violate, to rape. It's a very, I mean, graphically, visually, when I see okasu, it's a really violent kanji when you're reading kanji all the time. So I find it interesting, the language he's choosing to use. And the other thing I just want to say before I get to the response that Ashley asked me to respond to is it's been great seeing everyone. I really miss all my colleagues. This has just been a wonderful experience. You know, when school is in session in normal times, we're so siloed in our buildings and our departments, and we always say we want to like have these kind of conversations, and it's unfortunate that it took a pandemic to get us all together, but it's just been great to watch all of you and your talks and to have these kind of conversations. This is what, as Michele said, this is what teaching at a liberal arts college should be about. So in terms of sort of what I would like to see change, Saif, I really liked your mention of memory. That really ties into literature. I had watched Nancy's lecture, and you said that you advised us to do less with more focus. And that has certainly been, I would say, a positive of all of this, is that normally I think our lives are incredibly hectic, and it has forced us to really slow down. And my family knows I am not a slow person. So to be confined and wake up and like I only have one thing to do for the entire day has been quite interesting, if not challenging. So that's sort of, I think the positive is perhaps this will slow us down a bit. I think our society has been revving up the pace by which we all live. The other thing is I think, as Elizabeth, you said, there's a sea change going on right now. Saif, I think you mentioned it as well. And I really do hope we're seeing serious injustice, and as this pandemic has been unfolding, wrapped into it has been Black Lives Matter. And, you know, when I gave my lecture, that had not happened yet, right? So things are unfolding on a weekly basis. And I really do hope that we have some kind of social restructuring to deal with all this injustice. So then what's the role of literature? As I said in my lecture, there are many roles literature plays. I kind of addressed three: the issue of escape, which I have been doing a lot of here in my house, reading literature of the past because the present is kind of so upsetting. So I've immersed myself in the past. But it also, as Saif, you talk about memory, literature serves the role of memory, right? It's hopefully works are being written now, or might be, as in the case of the two works I analyzed, you know, decades out, that will capture the voice of what's going on right now. One thing that is a bit different with COVID-19 versus the 1918 pandemic and the works I discussed is, there was a time lag between when it happened and when things got written down and recorded. With technology right now, of course, things are appearing online as we speak. So in response to my lecture, one of my colleagues from another university alerted me to a website in Japan where every day a Japanese writer posts a short essay or very short story, and it's actually, the stories are being translated into English that day. So there's this huge translation project going on. So every day there's like a new story or essay. It's called Day to Day. Tree is in parentheses. And all the stories and essays are responding to COVID-19. But I'm sort of eager to see what will be the sort of canonical work of literature that comes out of this. Francesca, in your lecture, you mentioned Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, that change cannot happen unless the mood of the people really have to ask for it. And I think we're seeing that right now, right, with this amazing Black Lives Matter protest. I can remember when it first started on our campus several years ago, it was very marginal, and now it's taken on a completely different level. So I'll be curious to see what actually will be the sort of the voice of this time in which we're going through. and what issues will be captured in that. I think as the story unfolds, we're finding out it's not, there are many issues, educational injustice, food injustice, racial injustice, economic injustice, a host of things. So I think that is yet to be determined. So anyhow, I'll end there. I can talk forever.
You saved me from having to write you a little note to say we needed to wrap up, but thank you, Anne. It's always fascinating. I'm going to turn now to Laurie Anderson and ask you a similar question, both about what you think needs to change and how you conceptualize change in your discipline.
Well, thank you very much, Ashley. And as one of the organizers of the course with Ashley, I'd like to sincerely thank all of my colleagues for all of the time and energy you've put into creating amazing, fascinating, thought-provoking lectures from us, you know, for all of us to learn from. It's just been great to watch all of them and to yeah, look at all these different ways of exploring the problems and issues that we're facing right now as a society. In terms of things I'd like to see change, and this gets a little bit to the question also of how I conceptualize change in my discipline. So I'm a natural scientist, and I really value data. Natural science is extremely good at establishing cause and effect and exploring mechanism. So how does this one thing affect these other things? What are the cascades of interactions that lead to a certain outcome? But it really is not very good at deciding what we value as a society. And I think it's really important that, I mean, part of what I think I have discovered going through the pandemic and listening to this whole range of lectures is, and I guess a greater sense of tenderness and reverence for life. I mean, I'm a biologist, so I already thought it was pretty cool, but life is amazing, the life of an individual, the fact that Ellen Arnold talked about, you know, each individual who's affected by the pandemic, who we lose, has their own story that is now gone from the world. And I think really grasping that as people helps us treat other living things with more reverence and care. So we need the data, absolutely, but we also need a sense of reverence and tenderness. And if we really cultivate that within our society, my hope is that we'd be less inclined to treat people as we are doing right now within our society, and treat other living things with a certain amount of callousness or simply as resources, which they are. I mean, once again, that's an important perspective to have, but we need to have tenderness. So that's one thing that I feel is really important. A second thing I hope we learn is I really want to take the intersectionality that has become obvious during the COVID crisis. In other words, that this crisis affects economics, education, food, literature, our interpretation of art, what kind of art we make, the way that science kind of threads through it as a way of finding certain kinds of solutions. And yet to apply those solutions, we need politics and policy and decisions. I want to take that intersectionality and apply it to our next big crisis, which is climate change. Climate change is terrible. Climate change is environmental and structural racism. Like, if you think COVID is bad, climate change is worse, and it's happening. And we need to own up to that as fast as we can and start working on that. And I hope we can learn from the complexity of this crisis and really take that forward into the next crisis. So that, I think, is incredibly important. The last thing I'll say is just something very concrete. This crisis has convinced me universal health care in the United States. The fact that people have lost their jobs and at the same time lost their ability to be treated for the pandemic, to me, is unconscionable. And, you know, as Saif said, where is our humanity? Where is our humanity as a society? What are we doing? We have so much wealth. What is that really for? What are we saving it for? What are we hoarding it for? I mean, I think those are questions we have to ask ourselves right now. Is it not to take care of each other? Is it not to give people a better life? I mean, I don't know. Obviously, I feel strongly about these things, but the course has really helped me to clarify some of my thinking and decide what I'm going to work on next. Climate change and universal healthcare are two things that I'll be working on. And if there are students and alumni and faculty colleagues who want to join me, let's get to work, because now that we're doing, you know, now that we're working on COVID, I mean, we're not done yet on COVID, I get it, but there's plenty to do. And I really think with tenderness, with some very specific policy goals and remembering the intersectionality, there's much we can do. So there's no need to be hopeless, even in the face of something like climate change. All right, thanks, folks.
Thank you, Laurie. I'm going to turn now to Carol Neuman de Vegvar, who also is going to share a little bit about how she thinks about change.
Well, art historians have changed how we think about change. We used to sort of silo art, thinking about art into different categories. We thought about what it looks like, what we call style. We talked about content, and then we also talked about medium, or how it's made, what it's made of, and how that is that travels, those forms, those objects last or don't last through time. What has become obvious over the last half century of art historians writing and thinking about these things is that these things are not separate, and that, for example, how it's made speaks about the subject matter just as clearly as whatever figures are chosen, whatever symbols are chosen. And the medium is, as Marshall McLuhan so memorably put it, part of the message. And I think to some degree that is evident in the art that is emerging now. And I'm thinking about how art is interrelating with the moment in which we live. We're seeing on the one hand the creation of new images that are very, very powerful. I'm thinking of the portrait of George Floyd with the sunburst around him, which has now been all over the web. It's at the site where he died, but it's also been in banners on the front of speakers' podiums. It is everywhere. And partly that is not just the fact that it is a work on a wall, but it's also a work that is on the web, and the web has served as an additional medium which has taken it widely across the world. And what's amazing about that image is how it also ties together strands of memory, strands of commemoration, but also strands that have to do with that which we sanctify, concepts of halos that we see in Christian and Buddhist and Hindu and Islamic art, images that use that form so powerfully. So in many ways, it ties the past together, and then it goes forward in time through the web. And I think that is significant in terms of the way art is going to function going forward, that it is a visible form that can bring ideas together and present them to many people very, very quickly. The other way in which art is playing a role at the moment is in the demolition of public monuments, the memorials to the Civil War and so on that are coming down in this country, which is, by the way, also going global and is happening, for example, at the moment in England, other parts of Europe, and other parts of the world as well. There have been a number of monuments pulled down from the colonial period in Africa. Those have been taken down in the last week. My question that I would like to think about going forward is, okay, what are the larger objects that are going to come out of the pandemic? What are the memorials that we'll build? What are the objects that we'll put in public space, the sculptures or whatever they are, that will remember this moment? And I sincerely hope, and this ties into what many of my colleagues here have been saying, is that whatever forms those things take, that they don't just look to the past and remember the dead, although that is certainly important. And I'm talking not only about those who have died in the pandemic, but those who have died on the streets and the reason we have the Black Lives Matter movement, but also that look forward, images that, and objects that present concepts and ideas for community action that bring people together, that serve as nexus points, meeting points, not only of people coming together in a public space about an idea, but images and forms that can generate ways of thinking forward, of bringing this to the next level, or what Laurie Anderson said, not the new normal, but the new better. I think that art can play a very significant role in that. And part of that is going to have to do with the willingness of communities to, as we go forward through this very difficult time, also to support the arts so those things can exist. And that's important factor to think about in looking at how change can happen. That's what I have.
Thank you, Carol. That was beautiful. Nancy, would you like to finish up with a couple of reflections that you have about change and about how it happens?
Sure. So the question, I was thinking about how do the arts think about change? And, the forward thinkers, they expect it, they welcome it. It may require some courage in the performing arts. The traditionalists are skeptical. It's often the radicals, the young at heart, the young that push cultural change in the performing arts. Performing arts being a reflection of what culture is happening, that it's shaped by that. And more often than not, it happens in an upheaval. So I'm thinking of Beethoven, who was, the guy that said no to the style and was reacting to the Napoleonic Wars. I think of Nina Simone and Billie Holiday and their singing about racial injustice and lynching and poor children and poverty. I think of Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong and the kinds of ways that they were reacting to the vestiges of minstrelsy with such beautiful art and standing in it with such pride and dignity and incredible, excellent artistry. And even Dolly Parton, who has transformed the idea of a woman being in charge and not just being arm candy for the guys. And so it takes artists who they are often the ones that they literally can do nothing else. They have no other interest. They're obsessed, as Suren was saying. And those cultural shifts happen. And I think performing arts have a part in being able to express that and change minds. I don't know if any of you had a chance to watch Anthony McGill's version of Anthony McGill, the clarinetist who did the recording of the Star Spangled Banner, but he did it in minor, and how incredibly poignant it was to hear that sadness of our patriarchy, of our patriotism, and the shift of that. So I'm looking forward to seeing what Esperanza Spalding and Cecilia McLaurin-Salvant and Jason Moran and Kamasi Washington and John Adams and Carolyn Shaw are doing to create art that reflects what's going on and will push us into the next new normal.
Thanks, Nancy.
Sure.
Were you finished? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Okay. I just want to say that it's been a real pleasure to listen to all of your comments and your reflections. As somebody who obviously is interested in change from a political perspective, we sometimes think about both the sort of reaction of the state to what people do, but then also what the people are doing. I think it's sort of well known in political science that while we talk about revolutions and they look from the outside like they happen overnight, that they don't, that they rest on a lot of hard work that goes on by a lot of different people who have very different visions of what they want to accomplish in the future. And that doesn't just sort of miraculously appear. I think it's Max Weber who talks about that politics is the slow boring of hard boards. Sorry, too many boards. The slow boring of hard boards. And he suggests that it's actually really difficult to engage in political change, not because it can't happen and there aren't opportunities for it, but because it takes a long time. And these moments of sort of eruption are beautiful because they build upon all the hard work that everybody has been doing for so long. And so I think that we're going to end a little bit early here today, but just to say that thank you for all of your hard work. And to all of those who are in the audience, thank you for your hard work on behalf of the kind of future that we want to see. I also want to say really quickly a big thank you to Kira Bailey and Francesca Nestor, who have been so good at putting everything together for us and really made this course function. And I'd also like to take this time to say thank you to all of our COVID course faculty, not just the ones who were able to join us for today's panel, as well as those people who've been working behind the scenes to make the course happen. Will Kopp, Doug Thompson, and Allie Hausfeld in communications, Chuck Delalana, Elaine Chun from the Media Center, Liz Lang and Dee Peterson from the libraries, and obviously thank you to all of you in the audience, all of our wonderful COVID course students. One of the great things about Ohio Wesleyan is that we get the opportunity to learn not only from our colleagues, but from the students in our classes. And we continue to learn from them as we go forward into the world and as they go forward into the world. And this is a really special space and a special moment to be able to do this kind of learning together. And I think I'll just say thank you. And we look forward to seeing the future that we all create together.